Okay, this week I have the tremendous pleasure of talking to someone that I've gotten to know over the years. It's been a slow but growing friendship. The most recent time we spent a little time in New York as part of a thing at Columbia, and I got a chance to learn more about this incredible cat. His name's Tom Erbe. I'm sure a lot of people's ears just pricked up because he has got his fingers into practically everything. And so that means this podcast, we get to talk about everything. Whee!
Thank you, Darwin. Nice to be here on this Skype connection.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me. Let's start off by talking a little bit, or kind of covering a little bit about what your current activities are.
Okay, well, I'm a professor at University of California, San Diego, and I teach a lot of classes about computer music. This quarter, I'm teaching a class on programming embedded processors, so we're getting into the real low-level stuff. But yeah, we have about 70 students in our ICAM program, which is Arts and Technology program at UCSD. And we bring them along different paths, but now I have the little core that's doing, programming and really wanting to build their own stuff.
Sure.
That's present. I'm doing other things, but we'll get to those.
Sure. Well, one of the things that I know a lot of my listeners will be well aware of is the work that you did starting many years ago on a variety of algorithms that you gave the label of sound hack.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember the first time I stumbled on those, I think it was the first time I used it was on my Mac 840 AV or something like that. Okay. Right? Yeah. And it was stunning because all of a sudden I could do pitch shifting and time stretching and kind of, it was my first experience of really playing with sound in sort of an elastic way. It was really pretty interesting. And what's been interesting is to kind of watch those algorithms grow over the years and become parts of different things, right? So let's start off, first of all, with the idea, the sound hack idea. Where did it come from? How did you get kind of pushed into doing that?
Well, it was my first job after school was as a research assistant at UCSD, and that lasted for about 3 years. I worked with people like Max Matthews and Dick Moore and Mark Dolson, all these great researchers. But eventually I wanted to be somewhere with a little more musical action, and went up to Mills College and became the technical director there. And what I found was a place, in contrast to UCSD, was a place where really exciting, but we had no budget at all. And what I wanted to do was bring some of those sounds that, some of the processes we were working on, or really a lot of these were Mark Dolson's ideas, and turn them into things that the musician with just a Mac could use. And so, I was particularly interested in sound file convolution, cross-synthesis, the phase vocoder time stretching, that infinite time stretching that I hadn't heard anywhere but on mainframes at that point. And I thought, boy, this would be really special to bring this into, the tape studio or just anyone's studio.
Right. I remember the first time that I grabbed the file, I put it in there, and then, went to sleep. And when I woke up the next morning...
Yeah.
I had something that I had never heard before. It was amazing. And
you can imagine how this might be to debug these algorithms,
God. Yeah, right. Yeah. Exactly. The 1 day turnaround on a test, right?
Yeah.
Unreal. So as I recall, and as you mentioned, there were actually a lot of different things that sound hack sort of embraced. Who was it that you said a lot of these concepts branched from?
Well, Mark Dolson implemented a lot of these ideas. Most of these ideas have been around for a long, long time and have their own history. And of course, as most ideas pass through many, many hands, right, as they get formed. But Mark Dolson built a few of these tools for the Computer Audio Research Lab toolkit, which was something that UCSD put out. and that went out on 9-track mag tape to different research centers, and you basically had to own $1 million computer to run them.
Right.
So part of it was I really wanted to get these things out there where anyone could use them, and I mean anyone who could afford a computer. And even then, computers were a little bit expensive, but
Right.
it was a huge change.
Yeah, indeed. So, how primitive were the tools, and how difficult was it to take things that were meant to run on a mainframe and get them to even operate? I mean, did you have to do like language translations, or was it really like you learn the concept on one machine and kind of start from scratch on the other?
Well, I mean, a lot of things that people take for granted now, like having libraries that allow you to, read and write sound files or to do FFTs or to do filters, all of these things had to be built by scratch. I mean, there were FFT algorithms, but the ones that Mark Dolson was using were made in Fortran. And so I had to write my own in, of course, using textbooks and other guides, in C. And I had to write. And then for sound file formats, a lot of this was just very sketchily documented. Some was very well documented. The AIFF was, and I just had to write the code. That was sort of the attitude at Mills College was if you want to do something, just write the code, do it tonight. And I definitely got that attitude there.
Right. Well, one of the things I also, though, remember is that I think my first copy of Sound Hack was, I think I'd always downloaded it, right? It was one of the first pieces of software for which downloading was actually an integral part of interacting with it, right?
Yeah, yeah. You can get it from your Gopher server.
Right, exactly. But it's, why did you decide to do that? Why did you decide not to pursue it as sort of like a commercial thing?
Well, I was really focusing on algorithms that I was pretty sure the commercial industry had no interest in at the point. I mean, these were things that, yes, took overnight, and it was not the common musician who would want to run a program overnight to get a new sound. So, I mean, I did talk to people like, I remember talking to Studer Editech, and they were definitely not interested, and, but on the other hand, my initial interests in music were in sort of the underground community, and I used to read magazines like OP, remember that magazine?
Yes, absolutely.
And yeah, everyone with a record would be running a tiny little ad in OP, and those were the things that got reviewed. And this was all underground, all sort of bulletin board stuff. And I thought, this is my community. This is how I want to approach software, where I'm just, independent guy putting a little ad up and check my stuff out.
Yeah, awesome. That was an awesome story. So now, in subsequent years, you have made. Pardon me if I'm wrong, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, but it seems like the Sound Hack set sort of went dormant for some period of time, and then not. Now, what was happening prior to you making the plugins? Was it still floating around, or did you just kind of like put it on the shelf and not sweat it?
Well, it got kind of big, and I just got tired of making it larger and larger. This was around 98, 99.
Right.
And, and then we had to convert everything over to PowerPC and then convert everything over to OS 10. And there was all this sort of like busy work, just keeping the thing the same. And suddenly I felt like, oh, this is a business and I'm not really enjoying it. And then it seemed like Macs were going to go away for a moment. So I spent a good 3 years trying to build things in Java, and that just sort of fell apart. Java wasn't really ready for big programs at that point. Right. Maybe now, but so there was a little bit of failed experiments. But then I decided, hey, well, maybe I can put some of these ideas into plugins, and this would allow me to do just a little thing at a time, finish the project, and move on to the next. And so it allowed me to sort of compartmentalize all my work, and I could get really into something and then forget it. And so around, I think, no, I don't know what year, but around 2000, I started making plugins, starting with Decimate and a few others. Yeah, it was fun.
Sure. one of the nice things about plugins is that it kind of shields you from like the operating system hellhole. And believe me, like it's cycling, we're constantly crying every time Apple has any kind of announcement. We're just like kind of cover our eyes and hope that it's not yet another breaking operating system update, right? But in a way, plugins sort of shield you from the operating system, but not always. There's still plenty of ways that Apple or others can mess with you. Do you find
Yeah.
that it's easier or the same pain?
Well, there's definitely pain. There's ways of, I mean, you definitely have to reinvent your plugins every so often just to keep up to date. And like right now, I'm starting to use Juice, and this is a plugin building platform that allows me to write the same, 5 plugins with 1 bit of code. Uh, w- by saying 5 plugins, I mean Macintosh VST, Macintosh Audio Unit, Macintosh AAX, Windows AAX, and Windows VST. So now I have about 18 plugins. So 18 times 5, this is how many pieces of software I'm supporting.
That's
And,
insane.
I'm doing this by myself
Right.
as my night and weekend at time job. Yeah. So you got to really concentrate on that. But I should say, I'm still motivated to do plugins. Yes, it is a bit of work. But what I've always wanted to do is make something exciting that you can put into a DAW. When I worked in analog studios, you'd always have these strange pieces of equipment that had their own peculiar character. You'd have reverbs that you could get ghost echoes out of. You'd have delay lines that you could modulate and that would distort in certain ways. And so this has always been the character of my plugin design, is to make something that has its own character and is not linear by any means.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I remember when we were in Columbia, we were there at a discussion roundtable kind of thing about production techniques, and I was very interested in your talk because you talked about things like that and sort of about embracing the ghostly in the studio, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And I find that really interesting because I've long had a problem with people who focus on high quality studio gear because I feel like those aren't necessarily always the tools that have magic in them.
Hmm.
Sometimes the magic is found in some really crusty stuff that just happens to have its own peculiarities. Now what we're seeing is a move towards a lot of peculiar systems, and one of those, one of those certainly is modular systems. And there again, Tom Erbe has his fingers in the swirling his finger around in the stew of yet another sonic world. Have teamed up with Make Noise to produce some of the most outrageous modules that are out there.
Thanks. Yeah. No, that was lucky. I mean, I've definitely enjoyed doing this, and we've worked on, I think, 4 modules now, and we're gonna keep going. So yeah, it's modular is the one instrument that you really can't control, the one electronic instrument. All
Right.
acoustic instruments you can't control, but
Yeah.
this is the one that you have to practice. You have to play with a lot before you get any good at it, and it's that I think is where the magic is.
Well, I really appreciate you saying that because I think not enough people think of it in those terms, but the idea of practicing the instrument is very real in the modular world because the way that modules interact with each other is very idiosyncratic, and you have to learn sort of the kneecaps and elbows of your system before you're going to be effective with it at all.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's hard because there is also the motivation to keep changing your own modular system. So learning an instrument that you're also constantly rebuilding becomes a bit of a challenge.
Sure, sure. So let's talk a little bit about the modules that you developed because some of them really are groundbreaking, and some of them have a real callback to some historically important gear as well. So, like Well, which would you like to talk about first?
I'll talk about the Echophone. That's the first one.
Okay,
I mean,
let's.
Tony and I met each other at a NAMM show, I think, and I always love going to the NAMM show and going from booth to booth and just checking out everything that everyone's doing. And for me, it's an idea fair. And maybe I'm going to buy something, but mainly I want to talk to the engineers and find out what they're doing. What secrets are you cooking up, and try to pry it out of them, and then just start. Then talk gear, talk algorithms, and all that. And so Tony and I had a real good talk. He was putting out the phonogene at that time, and of course the name attracted me, and the look of the instruments attracted me, and so we started talking about samplers and granular stuff and all that. And I told him to check out my plugins, and to my surprise, he did. And he really liked what he heard. I think he recognized a common aesthetic going on. And this is one thing we've discovered, is that I can build things, and Tony likes, we sort of like each other's ideas. So with Echophone, this was my first project. He asked me to use this hardware called the DSP PIC. This is a signal processing chip. It's it's a little bit inexpensive, but it's easy to program, and it does have one problem, and that is it's a 16-bit register, so there's not a lot of resolution. And I started programming it in assembly code because I wanted it to be as fast as possible. And I found that it had a character that really lent itself to being a little raw and a little noisy. So this is the direction I went in the project. I better back up a bit. What I felt was missing in modulars. To me, a modular is a sort of beast of the 60s and 70s, and a thing you find in tape music studios. And the one thing that was missing in the current, the revival modulars, was the tape deck. So I thought of all those tricks you could do with a tape deck, vary speed and, echoes and tape loops. And this is what I was drawn to as my first project, because I thought this would be an excellent thing to add to a modular. And so I started writing a delay line, and this became the Echophone. But as I was doing it, I thought, well, why don't we do that old pitch shifting technique that the old Tempophone used to do, which was a little box you'd stick on the side of your tape deck, had a rotary tape head, actually 4 tape heads that rotated, and could go an opposing speed to the tape, or it could go faster than the tape, and it could do pitch shifts by having these rotating heads. So this is what I implemented in the Echophone, and to very similar fidelity to the original Tempophone. And so I made this little hybrid instrument that's a delay line. It distorts like crazy if you want it to. You can turn it up past 100%. Feedback actually goes to 150% with cascades of distortion after that. The delay line, or the pitch shifting, is relatively good fidelity for 1 octave on either side, but it goes 2 octaves on either side, and that second octave is really quite out of this world. So people really appreciated this, which, I guess I wasn't that surprised. It was a really crazy sounding module. And Tony had the wisdom to take the 2 main parameters and put them on big knobs. And so when people perform with it, they can really take those knobs and, play with it live.
Right.
So that was the Echophone. We did a lot to try to make it a part of the system. I mean, for me, the modular is really special because it's a collection of different objects. And these objects, it's really up to the musician, the performer, to put them together and to have them interact with each other. And it's not like I never want to make a sort of canned synthesizer as a module. There's never an island in modular if I design it. So we did a lot to have it respond to clocks and control voltages and, 1 volt per octave on the pitch shifting and all that. So yeah, it was successful.
Yeah, indeed. And it's just interesting that Well, it's interesting to me that your discussion about it was one of the first times that people really seemed to be doing interesting new development with quirks. Prior to the Echophone, I felt like everything was either trying to be high quality or was trying to emulate Buchla quirks, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that it was one of those two avenues. And so the reason that I guess maybe the Phonogene was sort of like this too, but the
oh yeah,
Echophon especially was one of those things where like you said, having the feedback go to 150%, or allowing the pitch shift to go beyond where it sounds good to the point where it sounds like interesting and its own thing. That's sort of embracing what has now become maybe a little more common in the modular world, but at the time didn't seem to be. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah. I mean, it's really I'm reacting against clean synthesis sounds, and
right.
I always like to push it further. And the biggest frustration to me is to have everything under a couple membrane switches and a little view screen, and where I can't program anything. You know, I remember the most fun I had with a certain synthesizer of the 80s was when I found I could just send random system exclusive into it, and it just suddenly started making interesting sounds.
So after the Echo, what was the module you did after the Echophone then?
After that, I rewrote the phonogene. So not really a module, but
Oh, so you were the person that did that firmware update.
yeah, I did a
Oh, I didn't
Rev 2.
realize that. Oh,
So
okay.
this is really interesting to modular people, but it wasn't. Basically, I got rid of a lot of aliasing noise that was in there, and I tuned it a little so that the knob ranges are a little more intelligent.
Right, right.
And so, but we kept it pretty much the same and tried to preserve all the noisy things that happened, including I made an accidental infinite record mode a feature. So it used to be you had to do like, various recipes of button clicks to get into this weird mode, which was an accident, and everyone loved it. And so I changed it so you just had to hold down the record button for a little while and
There you
got
go.
into. But yeah, I did that, and I felt Tony and I were a bit mixed feeling about it because it took just as much development as a new module,
Right.
and yet it was really just the old module, and we sort of felt, oh, maybe next time we'll just, we do something like this, we'll just make something totally brand new.
Right.
Takes just as much time.
Right.
So a little lesson learned because I think everyone would have been happy with their Rev 1 phonogenes. Well, I'm not going to start any arguments about that. But after that, I started on the Erbe, which
Right.
was my reverb. This one I did a lot of research in reverb. Most reverb was long, a sort of hidden art. And now there's many more publications out about it, or definitely at the time I was researching it. And so I just did what any research would do, a literature search, start implementing the algorithms, starting to studying the algorithms, and I built PD code to emulate every reverb I read about. So I made a series of PD patches, and I've made them into Max patches now too. So Max people, they're on my website somewhere.
Okay.
And I learned a lot about reverb, and so I then took all the ideas I found special and sort of jammed them all together and then started mixing. And then once I got a PD patch that I couldn't stop playing with, then I thought, okay, we're here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's golden, right? In your mind, what are the things that make a reverb algorithm cool? What are the things that suck you in?
Well, what I wanted again was like that weird thing that happens. Like, you might be fascinated with something like an oil can delay, and it's because some weird sound that doesn't sound like an echo. It sounds peculiar. It's sort of mushy, and it's not exactly the same sound you put in. So this is what I wanted out of reverb. I wanted a room, but I wanted I want sustain after my voice or a sustain after my note. But I want that sustain to be something different, a room that has an unusual character that I can't, that you haven't heard before. But I still want it to do the same thing, to sort of give you more sustain, to fill in after your note. So this is what I was looking for. And yes, I was listening to things like the ghost voices that come out of the Ursa Major space station, listening to the chorusing and the lexicon reverbs, various things like this. The infinite reverb that you'd get out of any sort of loop reverb algorithm, whether it's Miller-Puckett's reverb or the lexicon reverbs, all of these special sounds. And I just wanted to mix them up. And I wanted to put control voltage on everything so that you could switch the size in a millisecond. And that you wouldn't just click to a new size, that you would be changing the size continuously. So, you can get these incredible booms out of my reverb just by modulating the size parameter with a ramp wave.
I always wondered how you did that, because it seems like changing the size algorithm normally requires sort of a reset of the reverb, and so it's not something that's typically continuously variable.
Well, it's a reverb's built with a number of delay lines and a number of separate ones, and also some multi-tap delay lines, and then some special little delays, which are known as all-pass filters. And what I decided to do, and there's also separate multiple taps for early reflections. And what I decided to do was have this one knob reach in and modulate all maybe 20 delay times at the same time. Not all by the same amount, but by different gradations depending on what I'm modulating. So as we go from a big hall to a small hall, the early reflections change in a certain way. The overall delay time changes in a certain way. Yeah, so it's just a matter of modulating a lot of things. And I think most people wouldn't choose to do this typically in a reverb because it does take a bit of processing just to handle all the modulation. And in fact, I think in my design, the modulation takes as much CPU as the reverb itself.
As the algorithm itself, sure. That makes a lot of sense. It's very interesting. In order to really get a sense of all these reverbs, you kind of had to have access to all these reverbs. Where'd you get your hands on the various things that you emulated?
Well, I've worked in recording studios since the 70s. So I've accumulated equipment, and when we decide that we no longer need the Lexicon PCM70, it goes into my closet. And and if I need and of course I keep all my plugins. I borrowed a Ursa Major from a friend. I still have spring reverbs. All these things are just sort of hanging around. And then I bought a few current reverbs just to make sure I wasn't being too old-fashioned. I wanted to make sure my fidelity was up to snuff. So for me, it was a little bit of a competition with all the gear that's out there.
I will gladly trade closets with you, because my closet has like old tennis rackets and boots that don't fit anymore. So if you ever want to swap, just let me know. So that's really interesting. Now, you also were involved in the Telharmonic.
Yeah, I did the
pronunciation of that.
Yeah, this is the Telharmonic, and
Telharmonic. Yeah.
This initially, our initial idea was to make a combo organ. We were both thinking about PISA and Vox Continental organs, and it just, but we got to explore these ideas. We're listening to like Philip Glass and going, oh yeah, I wish we could have this organ in a modular. I took that idea ways, and basically I wrote code to give me an additive synthesizer so I could implement an organ. And I needed 32 harmonics, and I needed 3 notes at once. So I really needed, 3 times 32 harmonics. So I basically built a structure that gave me a pretty big analog synthesizer on an embedded processor. And then once we got there, I realized, well, yeah, the organ sounds just like that, and maybe it should be something more flexible. And at the same time, we always have this idea that we'll make stuff inexpensive. It never ends up that entirely that way, but we try real hard.
Right.
And one of the ways of keeping things inexpensive is keeping the number of knobs low.
Right.
If you add a knob, you add a jack for the voltage control, and then you add another knob for modulation amount, and it just stacks up. So we wanted to keep it down to like 5 knobs, and 2 of those would be relegated to timbre. I had to make some sort of synthesis algorithm with additive synthesis that just used two knobs for timbre. And so my idea was to have the flatness of the spectrum be one parameter, where if it is very flat, then all the harmonics are the same volume. And as it goes to less flat, then a central harmonic starts peaking out more and more until it's the only harmonic. And then the
Okay.
second knob became the central harmonic. So we called that the centroid, which isn't entirely accurate, but
Right.
it's sort of the way we did this additive thing. And it basically turned out like no other synthesis module. But yes, I was inspired by lots of additive stuff. I read up on everyone's additive synthesis, project, from the Hammond organ to the Telharmonium to Buchla's 360, and the Hal Alice box, of course,
Right.
and tried to pull a little bit from everything.
So you are a recording guy from way back. You're an algorithm guy that was a research assistant turned plug-in maker. You're
I
an
hear it
embedded
coming.
synth guy. Where the hell did all this stuff come from? I mean, what kind of mushrooms did you eat as a youngster to turn you into what you've become?
Yeah, well, I came from Wisconsin, so this
Yay,
is
Wisconsin!
so part of the Milwaukee music mafia. Not really. I mean, I moved out of Wisconsin when I was 16, but as I grew up, I was like, the unathletic, nerdy guy, and to me, the thrill was the Radio Shack 101 project kit. Or, I mean, when I was very young, my real big thrill was just to get a transistor radio. And then as soon as I had a transistor radio in, I think, 1967, I had the transistor radio open, and I was, playing around with the back and seeing what kind of noises you got out of it when you press these coils.
Well, and then very soon you had a non-working transistor radio. There's always that part of the story too.
Well, if you're as old as I am, you knew that transistor radios only lasted for 3 hours because the batteries back then just wore out completely, and your parents were like, "Oh, you need another battery?" No, that's not going to happen.
Right.
So you enjoyed a few hit songs, and that was that. But yeah, I was fascinated by electronics, and I have radio engineers in my family, and I had a great uncle who worked at WCFL who very kindly gave me an oscilloscope when I was young and a microphone. And from there, I spent hours just, watching my voice on the oscilloscope and playing around with things. And then I started taking apart electronics. So I took apart my parents' TV set, and I took apart my parents' car radio, which never worked again. And then eventually my dad thought, okay, let's take Tom to the TV repair place, and we'll give him things that he can take apart that are already broken. So I had a sort of a bunch of TV carcasses that I played with. And so this was just like, I was like 9, 10 years old, just playing with stuff and being a geek. At the same time, yes, I got a shortwave radio, and I was very inspired by all those peculiar sounds that came over the shortwave radio, those loud hums, those beeps, all those sort of mechanical stations, which I think are doing telemetry, but I had no idea at the time. So I started getting this relation with electronic sounds. And of course, the music that's stuck out to me in those days were the early electronic pieces, electronic pop pieces. Like I remember hearing Telstar early on, just being blown away as a kid. I remember hearing the Pink Floyd song "See Emily Played" when it was sort of a hit on AM radio for a while, and they had that sped up interlude in the middle. And I was, fascinated with sped up tape now. And then, of course, the Beatles made everything popular with Revolution 9 and, these types of songs. So it was sort of typical upbringing of a nerd, music-obsessed nerd.
Well, a lot of people that end up approaching computer music also have like this real are heavily steeped in some sort of instrumental practice. Did you do that? Were you like in school band and that kind of stuff, or?
I was in school band, but I wasn't very good. I mean, I didn't focus on it that much. I was in church choir a lot, and I did a lot of that, and I did a lot of singing, and still do. So that was a lot of my experience. Yeah, not so much. I was really focused on the electronics, and I'd say my real formative music experience was in high school, where we had a high school radio station. Now, this was in a suburb of Chicago, a station called WGHS. And back then, they high schools had radio stations, and as soon as they found out I could solder, I became the technical director. I, so, and had my radio show, and we started competing with my friends, finding the best vinyl, basically. So I was sort of on a path to weirder and weirder stuff. This was in the mid '70s.
Right, right. What did you end up going to study in college?
I went to University of Illinois and studied electrical engineering at first, and then switched to computer science when I felt that this was really where things were happening. Also had a concentration in music, so I took as many music courses as I could, and at that point joined a little sort of electronic punk band in Urbana, and joined radio stations, and just sort of really got into electronic music. So then I was playing Sequential Circuits Pro 1 and Casio VL Tone, those are my main instruments.
Nice. Great combo. So one of the things I would say is that you hold kind of a position that most people can't, which is that you're very comfortable with code and you're very comfortable with electrons. And,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, and a lot of people that are good with code have, at best, a hacker's relationship with hardware,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And a lot of people that are hardware hackers or are good at working with hardware tend to be pretty hackalicious in their coding. How is it that you are kind of have strengths in both? I mean, it sounds like you have background in both, but at some point, normally people say, well, I prefer X over Y. You are sort of like an X and Y guy.
Yeah, I don't know what I prefer, but it's not really about that. It's about what I'm going to do and doing something that's interesting. And I love it when the thing is complete and built and it's wonderful. So that's always the thing I'm looking forward to. But I'd have to say that I got in this position by just being very driven. You back in 1979, they were not teaching computer music at the University of Illinois. They were teaching me how to build antenna arrays. They were teaching nuts and bolts electronics engineering, and I was learning how to use punch cards to program a computer. None of those skills translated. I mean, I basically had to learn all the things myself. And so I was just never afraid to pick up the books, find the articles, and copy people if I need to. And then after I'm done copying them, just making my own spin on things, and finally, getting enough skills so that I could just build it from scratch. I'm really driven, and I'm not afraid of learning. So
Right.
I'm not afraid of failing either.
Right. So what's interesting to me is kind of the time frame that you went through all this stuff. So you and I are virtually the same age. I remember one of the biggest difficulties for me was actually finding information that was useful in any way. Now, I think you spent more time around university environments, so you had access to stuff. But I mean, it's hard now when if you have a coding problem, you can get on a Stack Overflow, or if you have a hardware problem, there's a bunch of forums where you can just say, "Hey, what's the story with this? With the voltage leg on this chip?" And someone will be like, the spec is wrong, right?
Yeah,
It
yeah.
used to be back in the day when the spec was wrong, what you ended up with is a whole bunch of magic smoke left the ICs, right?
Hmm.
You'd have to learn the hard way all this stuff, or you would have to track down obscure documents that were rarely published, and the turnaround time on publishing was terrible. It seems like the amount of data you would have had to accumulate to do some of the things you did would have been practically a full-time job. What was the thing that helped you gather up the kind of information that you needed to do the things that you did?
Yeah. I mean, there was a way of doing things in the 80s, and you would go to each semiconductor manufacturer would have a representative, and you drive over there and you just get data books. So there'd always be a day when us nerds would run out and just pick up tons and tons of data books, which would show us how all the chips worked. As far as programming, you'd pick up code that was working. You'd look at the C music source code, or you look at something Paul Lansky wrote, or you'd say, "Oh, I want to do LPC." So you'd sit down with Paul DeMarinis and say, "Hey, how did you do the LPC?" And he'd say, "Oh, I did this stuff based on Speak and Spell," and then you get in this great talk. And so it was a real social sort of thing, but it was also you'd have to reach out a lot to different manufacturers. Another thing, well, you can still do this. You can call and say, "I want to get a sample chip to try this out and send me some data sheets." And that's how you deal with electronics, basically. But I was in some very special places. When I worked at UCSD, my first research assistant job was assisting Max Matthews and building an electronic violin. So, I mean, I was, I'm made by my experiences. I'm here because Max Matthews put a lot into me, and Mark Dolson was building a phase vocoder, and he explained a lot to me. And, all my teachers are really responsible for giving me this knowledge. Similarly, when I moved on to Mills, one of my first jobs was to take a broken boucle touche and fix it. And this was an extraordinarily complex instrument, which was half S100 Z80, or rather TI processor. It was half digital, half analog, and I had to understand everything to get the thing working again.
Unreal.
So, it was a lot of good exposure.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, but also it kind of puts you in a position. It's not that many people have ever had to crack open a touche and figure out what the hell it did. So that kind of puts you in the position of having some very unique experiences.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That's cool. Now, there's another thing that I want to talk to you about, because I got wind of it when we were in New York. And when you first mentioned it, I thought that you might be a little insane. And subsequently, I hear that you accomplished the task, which makes me know that you're insane. And that is that you took on the Williams mix and did a recording of it. Correct?
Yeah. I did many performances of it. No, I did a recording. It's on a rap CD. But I'll get to that. Williams Mix is a piece by John Cage, a tape piece that he composed in 1952 and completed in 1953. And at the point, he found a certain liberation from time by considering a piece over length. That is, this is a tape music piece, so instead of note length is now literally length, and he was building this piece by looking at the length of tape and in inches, and instead of deciding where the notes are, deciding where the splices would be and what sound should happen in each splice. So the conception of the piece is really about, okay, notes are samples. Samples come from different families, which we can represent with 6 letters, A through F, and then we're going to arrange it in a piece on a score. So he made this score, which was really the cutting template for the tape. Now, because tape goes at 15 inches per second, and each page of the score has 20 inches of tape represented, each page is 1 second and a third. And this piece, which is 254 seconds, takes 192 pages, 192-page score to represent. And there are 8 tape tracks. You can think of them as 8 instruments playing. So there are 8 lines going at the same time. So, but he did make a score, and he published it. And to me, it was like, oh, a score is an invitation to do this piece. And I also thought, well, there are not many scores around for people who do tape music, right. So, and I do that. So I thought, I'm going to do this, and no one's done it before. And I just sort of did a little calculation. Okay, if I measure one page a day, I can do this whole thing in about a year. I'll just take my time, don't overdo it. And then about a month after I decided that, I got a concert engagement for 3 months up. And it was a Cage anniversary concert, and I thought, okay, I got to do it. And so then it was like, as fast as I can go.
Right. It went from being very relaxed to not relaxed at all.
No, but I'm a programmer. I'm a recording engineer. We're very often doing things that take long, long periods of time, and you don't get any enjoyment until the end. So you just think about, yeah, I'm doing something good. I previously worked on a Morton Feldman piece called For Philip Guston, and I worked on the mixing of that. The recording was done with a persistent click that came from expanding fluorescent light bulbs. About every 2 to 5 seconds, there's a click in the tape. And this is a piece that is 5 hours long. So my job was to take all the clicks out of this. And in answer to your question, am I insane? Yeah, kind of. But rather, I don't. I like working on weird music, and this is what I want to do.
Well, it's what's interesting to me though is sort of like, that's a thing of significance. And to what extent was the fact that nobody had done it before kind of an interesting challenge to you?
Well, the only recording I heard for a long time was this one from, I guess it was a concert around 1958, and it was recorded with microphone. So you're hearing the crowd, you're hearing the speakers fairly far away, and you can't really hear the piece. Later, Larry Austin reconstructed the piece using the original tapes, so you're able to hear a clean version. My interest was, well, there is this score, and you can hear like different versions of Fontana Mix by Cage and compare them. And I thought, well, let's see if we can make a new version of Williams Mix. Will it be the same? Right. And will it have the same character? And the other thing is, I thought, well, as soon as I measure all the things in the score, my data set is maybe going to be useful to other people who want to perform it. That now they can go to my webpage and download my spreadsheet, which has all the data from the score, and then maybe people can study it, they can make their own pieces. And I just wanted the piece to become, performable again. So yes, definitely the fact that no one had done it and that Cage intended this to be a piece that was performed, I definitely was motivated by that.
So what is it that you used to implement the Williams Mix? What tooling did you use to actually create the piece?
Well, I'm a very good PD programmer, and so I built the whole thing in PD, and really the patch took me only about a week to build. It's a sample player. It has many different ways of playing the sample according to Cage's score. It has fade-ins and fade-outs that can be picked by chance. Lots of different things in it. Manages tons of sound files, but it really wasn't that difficult. And I also set it up so it could handle various different kinds of venues. I can go into different speaker setups, and if I have the full 8 speakers, it's discrete. But if I have 4 speakers, I can emulate it all the way down to 2 speakers.
Interesting. How many sample files did you have to gather up in order to produce this?
Well, Cage recommends 500 to 600 samples, and when I started, I was collecting samples by, basically I reached out to a lot of my musician friends, and I thought, well, this would be nice to make it a collaborative process. So I had maybe 20, 25 people contribute samples to this project, and when I got to about 500 samples, it started to feel like Williams Mix. It really started to take that character.
Interesting. Now, how hard was it to go through the score and sort of interpret Cage's intent? I mean, did you find things that you had to just like make up because the intent wasn't necessarily clear?
It's really clear. I mean, the hardest thing is that the paper and the images are somewhat poor, and you have to measure things that are very faint. So I did a lot of Photoshop enhancement and all that, and I actually turned to some computer graphics researchers. and they gave me a list of all the lines on the page, but that didn't help. So it was a lot of work. The score is actually pretty consistent once you get into it. He definitely had a system worked out, and the score did not start until that whole system worked out, and the densities are consistent, and you can see the form within the piece. It's built in a sort of hierarchical manner, so it's fairly worked out, and it's actually part one of Williams' mix. Or the end of the score says end of part one. He did have more structure planned out, but the piece never got built. I bet it was a lot of work for him.
No doubt, no doubt. So going back, like on your reasoning for doing this or doing other things, I'm always curious when people take on sort of improbable projects or projects that have like an almost imposing, it's like things that look like climbing K2.
Yeah.
By whatever means you get there. I mean, this is one of them. It looks like too overwhelming of a task to be able to take on, so it's hard to imagine starting, right?
Yeah, but everything's like that. I mean, if you want to become a good musician, you have to practice an awful lot, and that's like climbing K2. I mean, if you really want to be good at something, you have to work. And the myth of genius is a myth. You don't just arrive at these things. All these things take tons of work to be any good at all. So, I mean, for me, I'm just attracted to what I think are special projects. Right. I know that some are going to take a year, some are going to take a month, and some, when I mix a CD, I usually try to make it take a day because I know I can do it that fast, but I don't worry about time for a project, except when commercial interests are intertwined.
Right. Well, I can see how you are thinking about that. That makes a lot of sense. Now, if you could open or give me a glimpse on what are some of the improbable things you're thinking of doing in the near future. I'm curious about what's going to come out of your next neck of the woods next.
Well, those who know me know that I've been toying with convolution again, and I do want to do some synthesis using convolution. Now, using impulse responses to give me resonances and make some sort of workable synthesis framework for convolution. That's coming up. I have ideas as far as, there are ideas I shouldn't talk about. There are some other pieces I'd like to do. There's an Alvin Lucier piece called Gentle Fire, which I've been wanting to do. But a lot of things in the hopper. I do want to rework some of my educational materials. I think I've gathered a lot of knowledge over my years, and I really want to lay a bunch of it out there so that people can have access to it. That's right now. There's more ideas.
Well, I'm really going to be anxious to see what you come up with. And for people that are going to be interested, you've mentioned several times that on your website you have material on different things. Where should people go to check this out?
Well, if you're interested in Williams Mix, you can see it on my website, tre.ucsd.edu. And from there, you can get to the code. You can get to versions by clipping, by myself on my SoundCloud. If you go to soundhack.com, you can find most of my software. And if you go to Make Noise Music, you can find all of my modules.
Awesome. Yeah, and now that you mention it, so I just recently interviewed Jonathan Snipes, and a really interesting and knowledgeable guy. But so how did Williams Mix end up getting tied in with those guys? How'd that happen?
They contacted me and said, "Oh, well, we like doing a piece of algorithmic music as sort of our outro." And they said, well, you're the Williams Mix guy, right? And but it turned out we're sort of connected through a lot of people from CalArts and Ezra Buchla and those type of people, and so we're all friends of friends. So I said, yeah, I'd be into doing that. And they said, well, let's do a Williams Mix using samples from our next CD. And I said, well, yeah, but you have to give me 500 to 600 samples in John Cage's categories. And I thought he'd say, no, maybe not. But like 2 days he got back, he goes, yeah, we'll do that. And then like a week later, he had all the samples. So he sent them to me, and I did maybe 9 or 10 performances of Williams mix, different variations, and sent them back to him. And I think they used about 6 of them on the various releases. So if you get it in vinyl, you get one. If you get the CD in Japan, you get a different version. You know, but yeah, it was special to me too, because I learned about electronic music and, you know, experimental music from listening to rock records in the 70s.
Right.
And I thought, well, if I can put a strange piece of music on a rap CD, this could be a connection for someone.
Right.
Open up the world a little bit.
Indeed. Well, Tom, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk. It was fantastic catching up with you. Fantastic to hear the stuff that you've been working on and to hear some of the stories behind them as well. I really appreciate it.
No, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, my pleasure. All right. I'll catch you again soon. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Well, I hope that you're having a great change of the time day today. If you're in the U.S. anyway, if you're a European or Asian listener, you know what I'm talking about. Although if you're European, you're probably at the Ableton Loop conference anyway. So just say hi to everyone there when you get a chance. Otherwise, thank you so much for continuing to listen and for checking out this interview with Tom. Tom's an amazing guy with an incredible breadth of work. I hope you get a chance to take a look at some of the stuff that he's been doing. Amazing guy, and I was so pleased to get the time to talk to him. And with that, I'm going to turn it over for the week. Thanks a lot for listening. Make sure that you share this with people that you know who you think might be interested. And if you have any questions or comments, shoot me a line, ddg@cycling74.com. Other than that, see you next week. Bye.